myself, but after that second visit, sitting alone in Preston's laboratory one afternoon, I insisted, during this period of time, I had not been part of the Montauk Project. Duncan and Preston insisted I had been, a rather an important part of it. So all I could say was I didn't remember it, which was true at that point. Sat down and started meditating on the subject, so to say. All right, what if I was actually a member of the project and had been part of it? What then? Well, for the next hour and a half, I started to shake like a leaf, and I knew that this was a body telling me that something was coming up. And was sort of fighting it and resisting it, but memory did come back. The memory came back of the trip to the director's office and being recruited in the whole 9 yards of my involvement with the project. And of course, more came back later. But that was shall we say, the opening of the door to the beginning of the return of my memories. Strangely enough, the Montauk Project came back first, and that was the most recent. Shall we say, the debriefing from that project was not nearly as thorough as it was from the Philadelphia experiment. Long since, Duncan and Preston had recovered their memories, and that was because of that. Many visits during the period from August 1985 to May 1986, many visits on their part to the Montauk Point operation. And they were both quite sure at that point of their involvement. So the memories of that back, it then became rather interesting with more visits to find out just what was going on. I moved to Long Island in August of 1986 and obtained employment there, which didn't last very long. And eventually I went back to Phoenix in 1987, remained there until 1993 when I moved to, of all places, Atlanta, Georgia. In the interim period in Phoenix, I kept working, and it was in January of 1988, late one night, on a Saturday night, I don't know which weekend of January, it's not that important. I was watching late night TV and large screen projection TV. At 4 a.m. in the morning, HBO announced that the next feature of the evening would be the Philadelphia experiment. Well, the movie had gone by me. I've never saw it. I didn't go out of my way particularly to see it, and there wasn't much time to go out of my way to see it because when it first showed up in the circuits in August of '84, I was at that point living in a little out-of-the-way place in Arizona. And this theater showed it for about 2 weeks and it disappeared. And I thought it was going down to Phoenix, but I found out much later that it was pulled after 2 weeks. In 1986, EMI Thorne acquired the rights for television and for video and produced literally a complete video of the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment. And apparently added some footage which was not in the original movie, according to those who saw it. Strips off the cutting room floor that they managed to salvage and add in. What I saw that night, starting at 4 a.m., the first 15 minutes was almost dead on what actually happened in the original rendition of the true facts in 1943. There were 2 or 3 minor errors. One was they showed a complete complement of the crew of 150 boarding the Eldridge. It was not 150. It was nowhere near that. It was a test run, and they didn't need the full complement. Number 2, they showed it was October of 1943. Out of the Philadelphia Navy Yard, it was actually August for the second disastrous test. The other part that was erroneous was that the base, which was connected with the operation, they did show the operation and the connection with Montauk Project Base, except they, in the movie, moved it from Montauk to Wendover Air Force Base in Wendover, Utah, and changed the date from 83 to 84. Other than that, the fact that we went underground and all of this was partly correct, and most of it from that point on was correct. Going back to the Eldridge smashing the equipment, all of that was portrayed in the movie. Needless to say, it had a rather strong effect on me, and I knew that I was involved. It took some time after that to sort the pieces out and to get more of the memory to come back. The initial part that came back very quickly was that, A, I was part of the experiment. B, I had a brother who was part of it. And the interesting point was, at first I thought I was the good-looking guy in the movie portrayed by Mr. Perret. Turned out that that was a role model that fitted my brother quite well. The runt that was there, who was the friend, actually was me, but I was a brother. That part was not correct. But I did have a pregnant girlfriend, which was correct. But what came back immediately afterwards was that I did have a family. John von Neumann was the director, and that he had made me a promise that if I ever remembered my involvement with the Philadelphia experiment, he would try to call me on the phone within 72 hours. It took him 48, at least to try. At that time, I was still working in Scottsdale, Arizona on a project. And that particular day, he, from Preston's office in Long Island, that is the company he was working for, tried to call me. He didn't know where I was. Preston did, had my phone number. Tried all afternoon to reach me, and the operator connected through the secretary in the office for the section, and she never bothered to make a note of the calls or to call me and say that somebody had tried to call me. That night, Preston calls me and says, well, where were you? I says, I was in the lab all afternoon. Didn't you get a message? Nope. Secretary never bothered to give me a message. Why? And he told me why. He said, you'll never guess who it was who was trying to call you. I says, no, I have not the foggiest idea. He said, it was John von Neumann. Well, I got very upset at that point because that was a first attempt, and it had been thoroughly thwarted by a very incompetent secretary. Whether or not it was her incompetence or whether there was outside mind control involved with this, because from that point on, things became very strange and very erratic in my life. I did eventually visit John von Neumann upstate New York. I have extensive slides of me, more than one visit. On the first visit, rather an elderly man with a beard, and who did not appear to be in the best of shape. The house was a wreck. The whole area within was a shambles of old electronic equipment, deserted cars, what have you. He owned a piece of property there. Lived in a trailer that was relatively new. Talked, about 2.5 hours on the first visit. And like a phonograph record, he repeated his history in New York during the war years and afterwards as an electronic surplus dealer, the name of Howard Decker. Well, the records show there was a Howard Decker, and there was a man who did all this electronic salvage, bought and sold a lot of stuff, made money at it. That was a fact. But the fact that von Neumann was saying that he was Howard Decker was rather curious. How did this come to pass? It took a while for us to figure it out, but obviously he had been worked over at some time after his usefulness for the government was over, which was not 1983, at the end of the Montauk Project, but later on, about 1986-87, with his involvement with JPL, designing a piece of equipment for them for the Voyager satellite and the Voyager trip. He did not anymore remember that he was John von Neumann when he was on location of his property. Occasionally he would take a wild whim and get in his car and drive to Long Island, because he at one time had a home on Long Island, and perhaps he remembered this, or for whatever reason decided to take the drive. When he got out of the area of his home, let's say about 20 miles out, whatever electronic system was being used to hold him in that altered state of awareness and that altered reality, wherein he felt knew he was Howard Decker, when he got far enough away, he was again John von Neumann. He went straight to see, of course, Preston Nichols. And he was looking for me, but that first event was by phone. There were subsequent trips when we managed to not connect, but eventually I did with him upstate. In the interview, the discussion back and forth, I finally asked him, Howard, do you remember the Philadelphia experiment? No, I don't know anything about it. Well, do you remember me? Yes, but I have no idea where from. They erased everything else, but not the memory of me, though he did not put in his mind where he knew me from. Eventually, it did come back, but only when he was out of that area. I have not seen him now in almost 2 years. The last time I saw him, he was deteriorating physically. But usually when he got too far downstream in terms of his health, he would take a trip to Europe and get himself put back together and get, perhaps the word is refurbished, and come back in much better physical shape and be okay for another year or two. I know he's still alive, but I do not know in what health or what condition. But at least we did connect, and that was after, of course, of my recollections. The recollection of the Philadelphia experiment and all of the involvements, and of course all of the other side projects, has taken many years and has been an ongoing process that is still not over. One of the other things which I wish to go into a little bit more later are some of the other side projects I was involved in. It was not only the Philadelphia experiment, it was not only the Montauk project, but in the time period between 1986 and 1988, the Montauk project being reopened in 1987, I was involved in other projects upstate New York involving the government and a person who became my roommate, or I could more correctly say I became his roommate in Atlanta, Georgia from 1993 till he died in 1996 in June from strange and mysterious causes at the age of 44. The only thing I can say in addition right at this point is that my life has been a hodgepodge. It's been a very strange mixture of things. Having been an engineer for 30 years, my engineering career ended, by the way, in June 1988, just before I went public on a lecture in New York City, before a private group about, quote, Project Rainbow, unquote, which was the official name of the Philadelphia experiment. Project Rainbow, by the way, was the name for the original phase of this experiment, or series of experiments, which involved, of course, two other ships, the DE-076 and the DE-013, the 076 operating out of Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard. All of them were outfitted at the Philadelphia Navy Yard with all the special equipment. The 076 is still, shall we say, alive and well today. It's still in service. The 013 during the test sank in the Atlantic out in the Azores. But so much of this history goes on, and the Eldridge, I might add, even though it was sold to the Greeks, or allegedly sold to the Greeks in 1951, along with a sister ship, under Harry Truman's Lend-Lease Act of 1950s. The Greeks acquired the Eldridge, kept it for many years, and then strangely enough in 1995, when the U.S. Navy goes back to the Greeks and say, we want this ship back. Oh, but you gave it to us. No, we didn't. We loaned it to you. They did acquire it back after extensive refurbishing in order to even bring it across the Atlantic, because at that point it was a rust bucket. And all of the photos taken at that time, which were published, at least some of them, were published in the Playboy magazine, Greek edition, in Greek, of course, showed the condition of the Eldridge and certain things about the cabling and the wiring which were still there I recognized as part of the wiring for the coils on the deck. It came back to Norfolk, Virginia. It's being towed across the Atlantic, was totally refurbished and rebuilt with a new hull under it. The hull was rotten and is today, strangely enough, still in service, but tied at the dock side of the Office of Naval Research and the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard. According to computer runs and the internet, it does make occasional trips up the Long Island Sound for purposes not stated. Why the Navy wanted to keep that and the fog alive, so to speak, and viable ships doesn't, to me, make much sense, but they must have their reasons. They are still very much afloat and very much alive and well. The history of this is very strange because not only my involvement, but those others who were involved, some of whom remembered their involvement after many, many years. One of the aspects of the suppressed memories and the brainwashing is if you wait long enough and live long enough and have no further instructions as to what to forget, it will eventually come up and you remember it. In my case, it was the movie and the visit to Montauk. In the cases of other people, it may be some other thing. Many of the elements which have come back to me over the years have involved a revisit, whether accidental or deliberate, and if it was deliberate, it was by design of my subconscious, to the site of some part of some missing piece of my life, some project I was involved in. Go back there to the area, you relive the atmosphere, you touch certain things in the area, and suddenly the memories involved with that area all come back. It is a rather strange phenomenon, but it's well known psychologically that this does take place. Now, one of the other things I think I need to cover here is why, when I was converted from Ed Cameron to Al Bielek, why was the Bielek family chosen? That took many, many years to understand, even after I was aware of the fact that I was not originally a Bielek, but it was Ed Cameron. Many years ago, having an interest in astrology, I went to a friend of mine. This was before I became aware of my real history. I was a geologist, but an amateur astrologer, but very good, and I asked him to do a chart for me. And he did. As Al Bielek. And he said it was a very complex chart. He didn't really understand it all. There were 5 fire signs in one house, and it was obvious that I had a lot of problems. And he went through the list of them, but needless to say, there was quite a number of problems, which he was quite correct in his analysis. He simply didn't understand it. Quite some years later, after my recovery of the memory of Ed Cameron and the fact that I was born on 4 August 1916, I went back to him. And I asked him, would you mind doing another chart for me? I said, I have some new information that my original name was other than that. I was born on 4 August 1916. I said, okay. So he did up the chart, looked at it, and said, I don't believe it. I said, well, what is it you don't believe? He said, this is exactly the opposite of the one as Al Bielek. I said, what do you mean, exactly the opposite? He says, well, it shows here you had good social standing, good social position, you had no problems with money, you had every opportunity open to you, and it was sort of like a wide open book of somebody who would be highly successful. Well, it was quite true that that was the case, and the family had a lot of money, good social position, and I did through the period that I was Ed Cameron. The only thing I can see, well, there's 2 things involved. Number one, when they decided they had to get rid of me as Ed Cameron, because of my traveling through time and the time loops involved, they could not kill me because of Norman Levinson time equations, one of the people involved in the background of the experiments. Norman Levinson was a professor at MIT, wrote a whole series of books in the open literature, 5 of them, on mathematics, and some work that is still classified to this day, the time equations and the time matrix. He indicated from his work, the classified portions, that if a rift developed in space-time, in the time field, it would be unstable for a certain period of time and then would start to settle down, and it would take another 20 years before it actually became fully stable of itself. And that interim period, there had to be dampening applied to it, or it might become highly unstable again. For reasons I do not understand, nor does Duncan or anyone else involved with this, which includes John von Neumann, we are the dampers, if you will, providing the stability for the time field to settle down to its normal flow. How this works, I have not any idea whatsoever. Apparently no electronic equipment could handle it, at least what we know of at this time. But the instability resulted because of the rupture of the space-time field between 12 August 1943 and 12 August 1983. One of the other things we didn't know is why this date, 12 August, was so significant, which I had mentioned earlier in this presentation. We had the drop-dead date, which was given to John von Neumann, complete the test by 12 August, or this was, of course, 1943, or forget it. And the other end of it, 12 August 1983, the Montauk Project was operating, and we wound up there after we jumped off the ship. The ship was yanked out into hyperspace. John von Neumann explained to us that because the 2 systems were operating on that same date of the 12th of August, 40 years apart, that they locked up. There were certain reasons why, and the primary reasons why we did not know at that time, nor did John von Neumann. In approximately 1986-87, after recovering my memories of the Montauk Project and talking extensively and visiting extensively with Preston Nichols, I came up with something which I'm not even sure where the information came from. But I was aware of that fact that other people, having done research, were quite certain that the Earth, like the human body, has its own biorhythms. The human body has 3, and they are easily charted. And they play some role and some significance in our psychological makeup and behavior. The Earth has 4 biorhythms, and strangely enough, all 4 only peak out once every 20 years. Preston Nichols did a lot of research with his battery of radio receivers. He has an antique receiver museum, if you will, and he cranked them all up, put them between stations at various frequencies, and took a measurement of the noise background. He found it fluctuated on a periodic basis. Talked to the people at his office and his boss, said there may be some significant information here, and his boss agreed and gave him a little bit of money to continue the work at home and bring it in to the office, and eventually all of his information was crunched on their main computer, and they came up with the 4 biorhythms. Lo and behold, all 4 peaked out at one day every 20 years. I don't think I have to say what day that was. It was the 12th of August, plus or minus half a day, 1943, 63, 83, 2003, forward and backwards in time every 20 years. Well, we finally figured out that this had something to do with the fact the lockup occurred on the 12th of August, 1943, with the program at Montauk on 12 August, 1983. Because on 22 July, there was no such lockup. There was no evidence of any kind of instability of this type. And the fact that the records of Montauk showed that they turned the station on 1 August, or approximately 1 August, 1983, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no let-up, was very significant in itself, because it has never happened before in the history of the Montauk operation. And it definitely was on that night of 12 August, 1983. Because of the synchronization, I think would be the proper term, due to the biorhythms of planet Earth, it provided the link, the cross-link, if you will, between 12 August 83 and 12 August 1943. The 63 point in this particular instance didn't matter, even though it was possible to lock up there because you were 40 years apart with these 2 programs. They both used similar math, similar technology, and similar field generators, not exactly the same, but similar. And they were both playing games with time. So with that additional synchronization, the locked up boiler, the Eldridge lift, the harbor, disappeared into hyperspace, which was possible to create. The math shows that it can exist, but normally it doesn't, except as a mathematical creation, but it became a physical creation because of the energies in the Eldridge, and they took the generators and the power systems with them. So the Eldridge was there in hyperspace, generating the field, which became a hyperspace field